From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Today on Take on the South, we're going to begin with a quiz. And the quiz has everything to do with words used during the American Civil War. So if you read lots of diaries, lots of letters, lots of journals by Confederate and Union soldiers, both sides, certain words are going to have more frequency than other words. I'm going to give you a list and decide which of the following was most commonly used. Was it Lincoln that was most commonly used by Civil War soldiers in their letters and diaries? Was it mother? Was it slavery? Was it cannon? Was it bullet? Was it war? Was it the word coffee? And if you said coffee, you're right. It is the most commonly used word out of that list by soldiers in their writings during the American Civil War. To explain why coffee has such an imprint during the American Civil War, we are joined by our expert, Anna Thompson. Anna, welcome to Take on the South.
Hi, glad to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you. Anna, before we get going on this fascinating topic, because it is absolutely fascinating, can you tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I am from Austin, Texas, originally. I'm a master's student here at USC. I am writing my thesis this semester on the history of coffee, specifically in the Civil War, and how it was used as almost a weapon by both sides, but really by the Union, and how access to coffee by the Union was more or less how they were partially able to win the Civil War.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, and I've had the privilege of reading the draft of this thesis, take us back a bit and give us the fuller context, a quick kind of potted history of coffee. Like, when did people start using coffee, drinking coffee? How deep does that history go?
Yeah, so it starts more or less with Islam. Islamic tradition says that it was Muhammad, and that it cured him of his narcolepsy. And when it was introduced to Western culture around 1650, it was something that was also kind of lauded for its medicinal qualities, right? It was good for colic. It was something that fortified the liver. It was for the gallbladder. It balanced the humors, whatever medicinal theories were going on in the 15th and 16th centuries. It whets the appetite. It cooled the body. It heated the body. It basically did everything. It was a cure-all.
I often feel that way myself when I drink it. I mean, I think there's some truth to this, right? But anyway, go on. Yeah.
Yeah. But making its way to the West and then into England, we're not entirely sure how it got there. Some theories say that maybe it was the Crusades, maybe even the Silk Road, but it was mysterious when it was transformed into the English palate, because it wasn't what we think of as coffee in the modern day, right? It's something that what we'd call Turkish coffee, more or less, where they would have it in the little tiny cups. You'd push it through the sand, that kind of thing. So coffee and coffee houses and that kind of thing really kind of boomed in the 16th and 17th centuries. And historically in England, there were these things in these coffee houses that were called, they eventually became known as penny universities, right? And these penny universities were places of thought. So someone could go pay a penny for a cup of coffee and then eavesdrop on students from universities. And that's why they were called that. But then it was also a great place for women to go talk. And they could go have a cup of coffee or have a cup of coffee at home and talk and that kind of thing. And then coffee houses came to America. Coffee culture stayed, it grew. And then during the Revolution, it became a patriotic act to drink coffee.
Right. So it has a very deep history.
Mm-hmm.
It's marketed as medicinal.
Mm-hmm.
Most things often are when they start out, right?
Yeah.
Okay. But there's also intellectual quality to this. So people are in coffee houses, they're exchanging ideas over a cup of coffee, and then it moves to colonial America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it becomes very popular here, coffee, doesn't it? But also, doesn't it become very political too during the revolution itself? Can you say more about how coffee becomes a political issue during the American Revolution?
Right. So the 1773 Tea Act comes along, right? So for people that don't know, the 1773 Tea Act actually lowers taxes on tea in America.
Yeah.
But what it does is crack down on smuggling. So that ends up making tea more expensive. So it becomes political to drink coffee because you're not giving your money to the crown when you're buying coffee. Because coffee was one of those items that was kind of easier to smuggle in because it's coming from places like Brazil and Southern Asia and that kind of thing. And at this point, the East India Company does not have a monopoly on those areas. So people, especially American patriots, view drinking coffee as a way to rebel, to the point that John Adams began drinking a cup of coffee every afternoon and said, tea must be universally renounced, and he must be weaned the sooner the better. And because tea directly symbolized British culture at this point.
Which, is a pretty fair statement. I mean, an accurate representation. Brits drank tea, and Americans increasingly drank coffee as a protest against British imperial policy. All right, so it's firmly ensconced in American culture by the end of the Revolution. Does coffee consumption in America go up considerably by the time we get to the Civil War?
More or less. It's really after the Civil War where we see the huge spike in consumption, because the Civil War is in the middle of the Civil War is where we see the establishment of one of the big coffee companies that we know of today, which Folgers. If you don't know, there's also a couple other Arbuckles which have gone defunct since then.
So Folgers was established during the Civil War?
Folgers was established during the Civil War.
Fascinating. Where? Up north?
Out west.
Out west, okay. All right, so we're going to get to this in just a second. So the Americans are drinking coffee increasingly, not radically increasingly, but there's more coffee consumed leading up to the Civil War. Where are they getting their coffee? From Brazil and other places?
Yeah, from Brazil, other places. At this point, sometimes areas like Java, some plantations in the country of Liberia, but the U.S. has not recognized Liberia as a country at this point, which we will get to later because it does play a huge point. But Brazil is the main country because at this point, Brazil is exporting 75% of the coffee in the world.
Wow. Okay. So America's taken full advantage of this. 1861, the Civil War breaks out.
Mhm.
So before the Civil War, Northerners and Southerners, Westerners, they're all drinking coffee, basically, right? It's the preferred drink, the preferred taste of Americans generally. All right. What happens at the beginning of the Civil War with regard to coffee access and consumption between the North and the South?
So, with access and consumption to basically everything, you have General Winfield Scott and his Great Snake, as it is so called. But this is the barrier that he puts around the Confederacy. That is the blockade that basically stops the Confederacy from importing anything for the rest of the war.
Right.
So this cuts off almost all of the supplies going into the Confederacy, which includes coffee.
Ah.
So for the rest of the war, the Confederates are relying on British blockade runners, the very small, very sad Confederate Navy running the blockade, and some trade with maybe Westerners for coffee access on the home front. But other than that, by like the middle of 1861, coffee access is pretty much done unless you are very rich or in the army and able to trade with maybe a Union soldier for some tobacco that you have.
So as early as the middle of 1861, the very beginning of the war, the South finds itself cut off from, well, reliable and plentiful coffee supply, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so this blockade is working, and people on the home front, as well as soldiers, can't get access to coffee. How important was coffee to soldiers, especially in the Confederacy? Was it part of their rations initially, or what did they do? Did they want it?
They wanted it badly. It was really one of the most important part of their rations, to the point that it's pretty well documented in quite a few sources that Northerners and Southerners, especially the foot soldiers, would go and trade with each other at night in these different camps. And Southerners would trade tobacco, food, even clothing for maybe like half a pound of coffee. Sometimes multiple soldiers trading for half a pound of coffee. There are quotes from a lot of different soldiers talking about how it was enough to make a soldier cry when they had access to coffee. Even to the point that it was like watching a cooing child when he was bent over his coffee pot in the fire. It was called the soldier's mania at one point on the Confederate battlefield, because it was really the one thing that not only boosted morale, but it kept them from more or less going crazy.
Okay.
There were points that when Confederate soldiers did not have access to coffee in different camps, they would mutiny, more or less, and vote vote generals in and out of position, because the generals would have access to coffee being higher in the ranks, and they would... A British officer said that he had never seen such colorful swearing, as when a Confederate soldier found out that his general had a cup of coffee when he didn't.
Right.
So it was really one of the biggest things that the Confederate soldiers wanted.
So, all right, so let me kind of summarize where we are. So the Confederacy loses access to coffee really early on, right? Yeah. And the Union doesn't. I mean, they've got it throughout the war, right? Civilians, soldiers, generals, the Union Army, Navy presumably too, they have coffee throughout. Right?
Yeah.
But it's in the South that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell me how much a pound of coffee cost somebody in the Confederacy by the end of the war, just roughly, compared to, I don't know, in the Union? I mean, what's a pound of coffee today? How much you go into Starbucks, you buy a pound of coffee. How much does that cost today?
Like $14.
All right, $14.
Yeah.
How much is a pound of coffee in the Confederacy by 1865, roughly?
So in the Union, it's going to be 27 cents for a pound of coffee.
Okay, that sounds reasonable, yeah.
In the Confederacy, it's going to be $32, 32
Right.
Confederate dollars,
Yeah.
which is about $700.
$700.
In
So for
today's
everybody
money.
out there complaining about how expensive their coffee is, listen to this.
Yeah.
It is expensive in the Confederacy to have a cup of coffee.
And
Unbelievable.
that is, there's no promise that coffee is not going to be waterlogged. It's not going to be bayoneted. It's not going to be, filled with maggots.
Oh, lovely.
Because those were all problems that the coffee that was smuggled in had, because it was smuggled in, and I'd say probably about 6 out of 10 times smugglers were definitely caught by Union soldiers.
And they're diluting it too, so they're making more money. Interesting.
This is before pre-ground, pre-roasted coffee beans. So the coffee that they're getting is coffee with the cherry on it. So that red thing, if you've ever seen a coffee plant.
Like
so
a coffee bean. Yeah.
The green with the cherry. So they're having to shuck it, and they get it green and then roast it. So
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
Right. And then the smuggling becomes more difficult because it's a larger volume that you're moving.
Absolutely.
All right. So I love this quotation that you found, and I want to explore this a bit. This is from, well, you can tell me who it's from in a minute, but the argument was that with regard to coffee, the effect on morale was like putting a new regiment in the fight. So plainly, caffeinated soldiers were valued soldiers, right? Who said that?
So this is the commanding officer of a 19-year-old William McKinley. For those of you who don't know, William McKinley was the president of the United States after the Civil War. He, at age 19, ran onto the battlefield at Antietam to give the front lines of the Union hot coffee. He and his fellow soldier and future President Rutherford B. Hayes were both there. And Hayes also wrote about this act of bravery, as he called it, and how wonderful it was to have hot coffee delivered to these soldiers.
I mean, there has to be some kind of physiological truth to this, right? I mean, there's a reason we drink coffee. That caffeine presumably focuses you, gives you that energy that you need. Oh, I mean, they certainly needed it more than we do. We're not fighting on a battlefield, right? So there has to be some kind of physical reason why caffeinated soldiers were better, right? Did they understand that, or is it just a vague guess?
I'm not a medical historian, so I don't super know. I do know that caffeine dilates the blood vessels, which allows blood to just run through the body faster. So I don't know what time period caffeine was actually found in coffee and allowed people to know, oh, this works. But I think the idea of a hot drink helping somebody is kind of pretty universally known, and historically it's oh, this hot drink is good.
So you've gestured towards how when Confederates could get coffee, it was smuggled in, maybe traded with Union soldiers for tobacco and things like that. But outside of that, I mean, that is not going to fulfill their thirst or quench their thirst for coffee. Do they come up with alternatives to coffee?
They do, and they're gross.
And they're gross. All right. Okay. What are they?
So they come up with these kind of ersatz substitutes. And they are things like sweet potatoes, rye, green beans, okra. I've seen China berries used once, which don't ever do that. They are poisonous. But a lot of times these things are dried and ground like you would coffee beans, and they're either cut with coffee beans earlier on in the war when they can get their hands on them, or simply, ground and brewed like you would a regular coffee bean. And, sometimes they lie to themselves and say, this is just as good as coffee. This is what I want. Or sometimes they're like, yeah, this is a hot drink,
That's about it.
About it. The big problem, especially with rye, is that it grows ergot, which, if not cleaned correctly, can lead to ergotism. So there were times where Confederate soldiers and just Confederate civilians on the home front were poisoning themselves using parched rye as a coffee substitute as well. So as much as they wanted it to be coffee, it very much was not.
And it just didn't taste like coffee. It just didn't do the work of coffee. In fact, it's actually dangerous in some instances. Yes. Fascinating. Good Lord.
Although there is chicory coffee, which I think might predate the Civil War. I'm not entirely sure, but it is still around. So if anyone's dying to taste this, the Café du Monde chicory coffee, go with that. Don't make it yourself.
Okay.
That was used.
Have you ever worked as a barista?
I have.
Okay. So did you try to recreate any of these recipes? Because they were often reprinted in newspapers, weren't they?
I have. I've recreated the sweet potato recipe.
Okay.
It takes about 8 hours of thinly slicing and drying sweet potatoes, and then blitzing them in a food processor. And I used a French press, and it tastes like wet sweet potatoes.
Okay, so it doesn't have any semblance.
No.
Oh dear.
You've ever eaten a sweet potato, and had butter and sweet potato left, and that's what it tastes like.
This is a mind over matter thing, isn't it? They're so desperate for it that they can convince themselves that the taste is like it, but fundamentally it just doesn't make a difference because it's not giving them the energy that they need, right?
Absolutely. It's very, very much a placebo.
Okay. All right. Anna, can you just gesture towards what the next few years look like for your work? You're doing this fascinating work on coffee and the Civil War. Where does that lead to?
No, I'm not sure. I've really enjoyed this research. It has been probably my most favorite thing I have ever researched. I'm in the public history track here at USC. I'm loving it. I'm graduating this semester. I'm hoping to go on into museum studies, trying to get a job in a museum field, hopefully. But, maybe my research will bring me into the larger history of drinks. I've been looking at the history of tea as well, just because of how much coffee was such a Southern drink as well. It had me looking at the history of sweet tea. Why is iced sweet tea never mentioned? And that doesn't come to the South until the 1920s because can't have iced sweet tea without ice and refrigeration.
Ice. That's right.
So maybe my research will bring me that way, but I'm not sure yet.
Sounds to me like a history of beverages is in the offing.
Maybe so.
Anna Thompson, thank you so much for enlightening us, telling us one reason why the South lost the Civil War. Thank you for being on Take on the South.
Thank you.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at UofSC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.